Welcome to the Parenting Podcast, Talking ECCE. With us is Dr. Paula Robertson. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Robinson is a pediatrician, pediatric emergency consultant, and she's the director of Just Kids Emergency Unit, Emergency Urgent Care. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So, can you explain a little bit about what you do?
I wear many hats, actually. So mainly I'm a pediatrician with over, you're going to make me feel old, over about 20 years experience working with children and young people. I'm very interested particularly in the interface between mind and body. And so my background is pediatric emergency and urgent care, but I also do things like teach mindfulness and yoga therapy as well. So I'm very interested in the holistic child.
Nice. So our topic today would be addressing picky eaters and problem feeders in early childhood. Can you explain the difference between a picky eater and a problem eater? Is there a difference?
Well, I actually, as we were just talking before we came on air, I think I have a problem with, no pun intended, both of those terms, in fact, because I think they actually have some negative connotations and they start the conversation around our relationship with food on probably a negative note. And in fact, who has the problem? Often it's the parent who has an image of what their child should be eating, and that's not quite happening. So the terms are often used interchangeably, but I think that they cover a very wide range of possible issues. And instead, one of the best terms I came across from a dietitian called Katie Kimball was, instead of using picky and problem, to use the word preferenced eater. Oh. I know, so I'm going to start using that in my vocabulary.
Nice. So are there some common signs to look for when we're thinking about not really picky eaters, but preference eaters?
I like it. So I'd see, in my experience, often this issue may come up for a number of reasons, but the most common time it comes up for most parents is in the transition from baby eating, when we can be nicely contained in a high chair and we feed whatever is given to us, to the need for independence that starts to happen around the toddler ages. So I'll always tell parents, you're now feeding a toddler, and you have to approach this a little bit differently. Toddlerhood is all about exploring limits, developing an identity, and testing boundaries, which often means that the things that they were eating while in their high chair, all of a sudden they no longer want to eat. They also have really magical thinking as well. So sometimes you'll find that it's not going to make sense as an adult, but it absolutely makes sense to them as a young developing person. So for us, one of the first signs is often around the use of the word no. Mm-hmm. Mommy, I don't want to eat that. That looks yucky. I'm not eating anything that's color, for instance. Or this color, for example, green tends to be maligned a lot. I'm not eating anything green. And so those issues may now start coming up for parents who are probably not used to perhaps having to tackle those particular challenges.
Are there any common misconceptions or myths about not picky eaters?
Preference eaters
that you think that we need to debunk?
Yeah, I think a big one is around portion sizes. Mm-hmm. I always say, listen, we inherit a lot of our ideas from North America, a lot of our concepts around kids' meals and kid portion sizes, which are often much larger than they need to be. Mm-hmm. So I usually tell parents, you got to remember a few things. A toddler often has a stomach size that's about the size of their clenched fist. Mm-hmm. In addition, a portion size is typically the size of their palm. Mm-hmm. So often portion sizes are a lot smaller than we think. And that's usually one of the reasons for some extra pressure where parents are concerned, because they want us to eat more, finish the plate. I know we know that growing up. But part of the pressure may sometimes be that we're actually aiming for portion sizes that might be too large, for our kids. So I think one thing I'd like to debunk is the fact that our kids actually have the ability to tell us when they are full, when they've had enough. Mm-hmm. As parents, our role are to make sure we provide safe, healthy limits. We offer choices that are appropriate and healthy. And our kids' role are to tell us how much they want to eat.
So are there any potential long-term consequences of dealing with preference eaters. So we're going to steer away from picky eaters and problem feeders.
Yeah.
Are there any issues that parents need to be aware of in terms of their children, especially in the early years? Are there any long-term issues that may have to be addressed?
I'll probably deal with this in two arms.
Mm-hmm.
For most parents, the concern is that somehow their children are going to be nutritionally deficient. Yeah, I know that's a big worry, and as a parent myself, I do get that. And I found an interesting study, I believe from 2016, that showed that when children were allowed a healthy range of options, and these were kids up to the age of 1 to 5, and allowed to make their choices, it might look different from what parents had wanted, but at the end of the study, no child was actually nutritionally deficient. So, in fact, our children have the ability to make choices within a healthy, safe boundary. But when there is that concern and pressure, there's a risk of us creating anxieties around food. And pressure is, one of the things I think as parents we need to be aware of. When we create an anxious environment around food, our body goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And I talk about this a lot with young people in preparation for exams because there's a few physiological changes that happen when we're stressed out. Mm-hmm. And one of the changes is that blood flow and blood supply to our gut shuts down so that our gut doesn't absorb food as well. Our appetite, and we know that when we're stressed or we're about to do something that has us on high alert, our actual sense of hunger and satiety gets affected. And so that has implications for us wanting our children to enjoy the meal. Yeah. So one of the things I often say is to try and be aware of the environment. You want it to be an environment where we're encouraging children to be open to exploring new tastes and textures.
Just to touch on what you were just talking about in terms of anxiety and stress around eating, should parents use particular language or languaging when they're trying to encourage their children to eat?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's probably 3 important tips I normally tell parents. And again, I have to reference Katie Kimball about this. She talks about the magic 3 things, which is prepare the space, first of all. You want to make sure, for a few reasons, that it's welcoming, that your attitude is more about just try. Just try a new food. In our house, we just have to try a taste and see what that's like. But also that it's appropriately spaced from snacks. So sometimes what happens is I'll get parents who tell me their kids are not eating, but when you ask, they're constantly grazing on snacks, or they have open access to the snack drawer, for example. But when that happens, they're taking the edge off of their hunger and filling up on empty calories. So you want to make sure that you space apart your meals. We're looking at about maybe 3 little meals during the day with about 2 or so healthy snacks. So fruit, for instance, cheese, yogurt, but separated by about 2.5 hours. So 2 to 3 hours in between, right? So preparing that space to allow for exploration with a decent gap between the snacks. The other thing is lead with your ACE, which means you want to front load that meal with veggies, first of all, and at least offer them that option. And then the last one is keep a poker face. So don't get pulled into the battle. Don't get sucked into bribing. Because often what happens then is if you have and this is an easy one to fall into, when you eat this meal, I will give you the yummy dessert. Because what we're accidentally telling them is this food is yucky, and instead it's the actual chocolate, the dessert, the whatever that's coming after that you should be looking forward to. So you need to watch your language. And the other thing is, I'll often get parents who want their kids to eat veggies, but they themselves don't like to eat them. So know that you have to be in that space and be willing to eat foods that are at least the same color, eat alongside our kids as much as possible.
Thank you so very much for that, Dr. Paula. We're going to take a short break and we will be right back. Welcome back to the Parenting Podcast, Talking ECCE with Dr. Paula Robertson. Just before we left off, we were talking about just ensuring that there's that space between what children eat in terms of their snack and their meals and so on. How does culture or societal factors influence children's eating habits?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think one of the biggest cultural and societal changes has been digital in terms of our access to devices, screen time, and social media for many reasons. But I'd probably preface this by saying we've got to recognize that eating is more than just food. It's actually a multisensorial experience. It's one of the few activities that uses all 5 of our senses, in fact. And so for us to really enjoy and get the most out of our experience and develop a healthy relationship with food, we have to be open to all that sensory input, what it tastes like, how it smells, what it touches when we touch it, what it feels like, those kinds of things. But one of the things that I see happening a lot is parents actually putting children in front of a device to eat because it keeps them captive. But what it takes away is that sensory input. And it means that we're not really getting the full experience. It affects our taste as well. And we know from a lot of studies that eating in front of a device, what's called mindless eating, is strongly associated with obesity later on. Yeah, it is. So it's one habit I usually tell parents try and avoid. I know it requires a little bit more input, but it's actually much more helpful for kids to eat together with the family. So I really want to bring back family meals. That's a huge benefit.
And when you're in front of a device or a screen, it takes away opportunities for parents to engage their child and talk about what you're eating, how is it tasting, that kind of thing.
Even how was your day, right? Yeah.
So this is a good lead-in terms of what strategies can parents and caregivers use to help children overcome preference eating, not picky, but preference eating.
Yeah, I'd say I have a few. And, recognizing every child is different. There's a little toolbox that you can pull from. So the first is to be a role model and recognize that actually your role as a parent is really powerful. We were chatting as well during the break that there is an important study that shows that kids are 61% more likely to try a new food if the adult that they're with is also eating the food that's either the same or the same color. So eat with your kids and make sure that you involve them in meal times as well. The second is to get them involved. We talked about the fact that the toddler is often exercising independence, and so that's part of the issue that we see as parents. But they often have a sense of pride and a willingness to get involved. So even though it might be messy in the kitchen, getting them involved in choice and actually limited and healthy choices, but involved in actually stirring the pot or preparing the meal or even choosing the vegetables. When my son was younger, we used to go picking veggies. And the idea here, there was a little farm at the time that was open, was that he could choose whatever he wanted to pick. The thing was that he had to eat it. So when we'd come home, we'd prepare all sorts of pizzas at home, etc., with the cherry tomatoes or whatever we had gotten. So getting them involved is huge. Bringing back family meal times and avoiding dependence on screens and distractions is another one, so that they actually are getting all that sensory experience. And just be open to offering choices repeatedly. It takes about 10 to 20 tastes or experiences with a food to acquire a taste for it and to get used to it. So maybe we try, squash this time around and it's a no-go, but it doesn't mean that you give up. Yeah, you may want to offer it again at another meal later on, maybe a few days down the line. And one last powerful tip is if you're introducing a new food, offer it alongside something that you know that they like. And sometimes I can actually get them to at least have a little try, a little taste. And really at the end of the day, we want to make sure that our relationship with food is an enjoyable one. So sometimes we can gamify food. So I have a nice game that I use with some of our younger kids called Try the Color Wheel. So we get a point for even touching or tasting, more points for actually taking a little bite of a food of different colors, and they get to choose which colors. So maybe some foods that are orange, some foods that are green, because we really want to eat the rainbow, so reds and so on as well, right? So making it fun.
What role does modeling play in terms of healthy eating behaviors and habits for young children?
Yeah, I think that comes back to the points we were making just now about the fact that our role as parents is really powerful. Mm-hmm. What we choose and the way that we interact with food, actually, they're watching us all the time. Mm-hmm. So definitely we want to be open to trying new tastes. We want to show them that food's enjoyable, that it is a multisensory experience. And I think in particular, really that we can make healthy choices around the foods that we have both between our meals as well. So having, for example, lots of fruit available as snacks, for example, rather than a heavy reliance on processed foods, which we know tend to be high in sugar and salt. Yeah.
And I guess if it's in the home, the children will be inclined
Absolutely.
to eat it. So if you lay out maybe fruit, and it could be local fruits, that they would be inclined to try that faster than if you have the snacks out, then they'll be inclined to try that faster.
Agreed, yeah.
Can you provide tips for creating a positive mealtime environment?
So I think taking some of the pressure off, which often means taking the pressure off as parents, because we still want our kids to get that nourishment that sometimes we add to this as well. So really just recognizing we want to make this an enjoyable space. The second is to be creative. And remember, we talked about the fact that toddlers are very magical thinkers. And so for us as adults, it doesn't always make sense. But the same carrot that they did not want to eat just now, if it's arranged maybe in a lion face, all of a sudden becomes the next best thing to sliced bread. Or using things like cookie cutters to cut out shapes, for instance, can be a great idea. Adding natural color options. So, for example, beets and beet juice gives a nice red color to things. So we used to make blood pancakes, which you can just add things like that too. And the idea that they can actually really enjoy just a taste, just a try of something new without feeling pressure to do so.
Are there any red flags that indicate when it's time to seek professional help in terms of children who you find they're prolonged picky preference eaters or problems?
And again, there's a few layers to this. So sometimes part of the issue may be, we're talking about generally with toddlers, but there are some children, for instance, for whom the issue may be a little bit deeper than that. And again, the whole idea around eating is that it's such a complex activity. It actually requires 32 separate steps for us to learn how to get food from the tip of our tongue to actually safely swallowing it. And so if there's any issues along those lines, for instance, issues with tongue movement or strength, posture, being able to sit up, for example, sensory issues. Some of our kids, for instance, are very sensory avoidant or sensitive. So that may mean that there's certain feels that they definitely don't enjoy, or even loud noises around meal times. Bright colors may actually turn them off. So if you're noticing a trend or pattern with those, definitely if there's issues around weight gain. So if you're finding that your young person isn't putting weight on steadily or is actively actually losing weight or is underweight, then it's definitely worth considering talking about this with your pediatrician or your child's doctor.
When we are talking about foods and the types of foods that children should be exposed to, are there specific foods or nutrients that parents should be especially mindful of in terms of providing their children with?
Yeah. So essentially what you want is to eat the rainbow of colors. The basic rules I tell parents are you really want to make sure that you're having lots of whole, unprocessed foods. That means as close to nature as possible. And essentially the rainbow of colors provides most of the trace minerals, micronutrients, and so on that we need. In addition, unless you are vegetarian, having some form of lean animal protein, so things like fish, ideally wild caught, and chicken are actually okay. And if you are vegetarian, you just need to rotate through all of the peas, beans, and legumes to make sure they're getting a wide range of all of those. Essentially, a good West Indian diet is what they need.
Thank you so very much, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Robertson. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Parenting Podcast, Talking ECCE with Dr. Paula Robertson. So, just to go back to our 3 to 5 year olds, are there any other myths that you'd like to debunk in terms of parents supporting preference eaters?
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think one of the big issues that we sometimes come across is the fact that when children are showing that they have strong opinions about eating, occasionally I do come across parents who will reach for something easy like milk in a bottle still, or some sort of formula. And actually the first thing I'd say to that is, in fact, first rule of thumb is that kids at this age should be eating essentially what the rest of the family is eating from the family pot, provided it's a healthy West Indian diet, and that they no longer have such a heavy requirement for milk. If they have dairy in their diet, for instance, things like cheese, yogurt, even if they're cooking with butter and so on, that counts as part of your food group. And so you don't really need to have a lot of additional milk on top of that. I usually cap it off at a maximum of 16 ounces of milk per day. That's 2 kind of glasses of milk or equivalent. And I definitely stop bottles at a year. It starts to cause issues with teeth and dentition, both the formation of teeth, so we can get an overbite around something like a nipple or a teeth, but also if they go to sleep with the bottle in the mouth, it causes bottle cavities. So the only liquid they need is really water, right? And your dairy can be incorporated in your food groups otherwise.
Dr. Robertson, within our early childhood centers, in terms of our policy, what children eat, we encourage parents to pack healthy food. In terms of a healthy snack, we encourage a lot of water, no box juice. And sometimes this can be a lot for parents. Do you have any tips and tricks for parents bringing their children to preschool to encourage healthy eating?
Yeah, no, I'd definitely say a couple of practical tips. First of all, to get kids involved in preparation, especially prepare as much as you can the night before. And so get them to actually choose between some healthy choices. One of the best things I've seen is, I was never this organized, but my sister-in-law used to have a little menu on the fridge, for instance. And so everybody knew what to expect for the next few days. The other is prepare stuff that's easy to hold in little hands and interactive. So things like carrot sticks and hummus. That's a fantastic healthy snack, for instance. Use seasonal fruits. So we don't have to, I'm always amused that our kids tell us they like strawberries and apples. And, we're not exposing them to a palate of what's seasonal, because actually we need to eat what's seasonal. Our bodies are designed to require seasonally different nutrients throughout the year. And so using whatever is available and seasonal and chopping that up into little slices or bits that they can hold on to and eat on the go is actually a really nice alternative as well. Yeah.
And what are some resources and support networks that might be available to parents of preference eaters?
Yeah, and I'd say there's a few. First of all, if you're always worried or concerned, especially about your child's growth, always discuss it with your child's doctor or your pediatrician. But in terms of ideas from other parents and other networks, I'm a big believer in getting ideas in this case, on the internet. I used to use Pinterest a lot. Pinterest has some great recipe ideas and just ideas on presentation for toddlers and making food fun. I also often work alongside other therapists who specifically have interest in foods and eaters who may need a little bit of support. So shout out here to Gabby Sanka, who is an occupational therapist who runs a food school online. And so I think her handle is @Gabby_Sanka. But if you want to check her out, she actually runs regular virtual food schools for kids and their parents if they're struggling a little bit with eating. And the last group are nutritionists. There are lots of dietitians who are actually really helpful and can give practical advice. Again, shout out here to Kimberly Divitai, who's a pediatric nutritionist, and then we often will refer kids and families to her as well for further advice. So there are lots of resources out there.
Any final takeaways that you really think after this discussion that parents need to keep in mind?
I would say, remember, this is not just about problem eating. It is instead about helping children develop a healthy, lifelong relationship with food. So remember to model good behaviors, to make food time fun, to actually make sure that we're offering choices and getting them involved. And those big threes: lead, create a space, right? Make sure that you lead with your ease and you keep your poker face.
So, Dr. Robertson, have you seen any children with special needs that may have challenges with feeding?
Yeah, no, this is a particularly special group. So I would probably say that our children who are neurodivergent, meaning that they may have additional needs outside of our typical toddler, and that would include kids, for example, who are on the autistic spectrum, who have sensory processing issues, who maybe have neuromuscular issues like cerebral palsy, for instance. They can pose some specific challenges, but not insurmountable. It just needs a little extra support and input. So remember, we talked about the fact that there's different factors that come into play with feeding, and feeding isn't just about putting food in. It actually requires all of your senses and those 32 different steps. So for instance, if there's an issue, for example, with the palate, with difficulty with tongue movement, with tongue strength, and being able to coordinate that comfortably. We'll see that, for example, with kids who maybe have issues with swallowing, and they would often need the input of some specialties, like, for example, speech and language therapy or occupational therapy. And so that's why it's important to discuss with your pediatrician in that case. Sometimes it's about processing. And as we talked about earlier, your senses may sometimes be overwhelming in specific situations, especially if you have sensory processing issues. So for some kids, that's a lot of noise. For some kids, it's color. Yeah. So for example, if the food is being presented on a very colorful plate in the middle of a schoolroom with lots of screaming kids, their appetite is suddenly gone, essentially. Some kids don't like certain textures. I've got some kids on the autistic spectrum who will only eat foods of certain colors, for example. And so trying to work within that and getting them to gradually develop that palate, that sort of taste range that they're willing to explore. Often that does need some special input, and again, our occupational therapists will usually be involved in that as well. And for some kids, for example, those who have conditions like cerebral palsy, they may have issues like reflux or acid reflux, for instance, which make eating sometimes uncomfortable. And so we know that if it's uncomfortable, we're going to not really enjoy the whole feeding experience. And so, again, this is important to discuss with your doctor because there's often medical management that can actually help that situation. Yeah.
Dr. Paula Robertson. So, Dr. Robertson, what about sugars? Because we're talking about children with special needs. Mm-hmm. How does the amount of food or the amount of sugar in the foods that they eat impact our preference eaters?
Yeah. So I'd say the sugar question is a big one. You know, in our diet, we do require carbohydrates and sugar, but the source of the sugar is important. So what we want are healthy sugars that come from fruits and even some vegetables and natural carbohydrates, again, as close to nature as possible. The issue comes when we have a lot of added and processed sugar, because often that comes alongside other issues like additives, coloring, additional salts, flavorings, etc., which generally have little to no nutritional value and can be associated with issues as well. So we want to, first of all, think about going as natural as possible. And the second is looking at how much in terms of the amount of additional processed sugar there is. So it is said that we should be looking at having, for young growing children, the equivalent of 6 spoonfuls of sugar a day. Just be wary because a lot of packaged fruit juices can have as much as 16, right? So if you're having that a lot during the day, you know you're already exceeding your body's required amount. So you want to make sure balance, source of your sugar as well, and avoid minimizing how much ultra-processed food there is, i.e. stuff in a pack, lots of coloring, stuff that you can't pronounce, that usually is nutritionally empty food.
Dr. Paula Robertson, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the insightful information. Thank you for joining us in the Parenting Podcast, Talking ECCE.